I have a question for you. How many soldiers is one Napoleon worth? How do we compare such noteworthy individuals, such great men, to ordinary people? Great man theory is a lens of understanding history that focuses on the actions of exceptional individuals as the motivators of historical momentum, new ideas, inventions, moments of change, even revolution. Originally described by a man named Thomas Carlyle in the mid-1800s, the theory has gone on to inform many contemporary perspectives, particularly around the role of heroes within society and, of course, within history. The experience of playing Europa Universalis 4 is defined by great men. In a small irony, however, we, as players, are not the great men. We are the state, so to speak, playing as France, not Napoleon. And yet we rely very strongly upon great men to make our nation great. Taking the form of leaders and advisors, great men give us the power to play the game. The main way a player exerts control in the game is through warfare and the deployment of the game's various currencies. Now, when I say currencies, I mean both the literal currency, represented in the game as ducats, money in the state treasury, and I mean the far more consequential and limiting accrual and use of monarch points, referred to by the community affectionately as mana. Monarch points, MP, are used for most actions in the game, from integrating states and people to advancing techs and developing the economy. They are obtained primarily through the natural ability decided from birth/ascension of the country's leader, and secondarily through advisors. Tertiary to this is events, but those are a different kind of random than stat distribution. As such, the importance of securing a capable leader is paramount. More than for the sake of dynastic continuity or stability, the significance is placed on point generation. Republics are able to get high points with a fair amount of consistency and thus are pretty good at getting techs and expanding and developing and playing the game as a whole. There are no pure dud republic leaders where monarchy might hand you an heir with all zeros who inherits at 13 and rules for 57 years. Great men feature into the game as the leaders, advisors, and military commanders of your country. They are generated for the player semi-randomly unless they come from a special event, and those special events bear some scrutiny. Certain events in the game grant you a bonus, and often an advisor based on what area your country encompasses, sometimes being the right country, but irrespective of how you became said country. In some sense, meaning this game presumes that the birth and prominence of Leibniz is inevitable for the province holder, regardless of the in-game history. And on some level, this conforms to great man theory. The greatness of said men is so great that they overcome all adversity in order to shape the world. It's kind of a takes pressure to make diamonds theory. As such, it doesn't totally matter what history the world has. Leibniz would rise in any world. Napoleon is an eventuality. Jerry Seinfeld would always find a way to give the world the B-movie. Important to note here is that EU4 is not very on rails as history games go. Everything before and at the start point of the game presumes real history happened, but after that, it's bound to deviate. Monarch points, as the name suggests, come mostly from the stats of the leader/monarch. Note when I say monarch from here on, I mean the leader, as opposed to the advisors. The points are called monarch points regardless of government style, and I'll be adapting that as a shorthand. Advisors are a secondary source, but they're also one the player has a lot more control over. So they may be secondary, but they can also be far more consistent. I won't spend any longer on it, but it can't be overstated how crucial these points are to your game. Military leaders do not generate points, but are deeply significant to the success of a nation's armies. Being leaderless can mean utter defeat. It's not that only great men can do anything in this lens of history, it's that they direct the flow. It would be absurd to claim that these men would somehow be able to create empires from dust, just as it would be insane to say any other factors of EU4 don't matter. A religiously isolated pre-feudal one-province miner isn't going to just win a war by virtue of having a leader with all sixes. The idea is that heroes, great men are the critical factor, the one that outsteps all others. Think of it like, say you had an equivalent tech to another country and the same ideas, but no general, and they had one. Now, how many more troops would you need than them to still win? Does that mean the general is worth thousands of men? In reality, we could ask the same question with Napoleon or Hannibal. How much did their presence change the tide? How many ordinary men are the great men worth? If we assume there's a concrete but incalculable answer to these questions, you can see why this theory manages to catch people's attention. Ultimately, refuting it sounds like doing the impossible math in reverse, being forced to come up with an answer for what one Napoleon is worth. We'll address this in greater detail later in the series, but there's a reason why the implied absolutism of great men fits very well with games in general. To give a preview, think about how implicitly absolutist you are in Civ or Europa. You never give orders for troops or city production and get back absolutely not as a response from the game. Unlike a game like Crusader Kings, advisors are basically uncontroversial and good. A few events have them like committing adultery or getting fired, but they don't have their own agency to sabotage you. Kings don't have deep personalities that just choose to do things out of your control. The AI has some small personality constraints, and they're kind of charming, like perfectionists avoiding messy borders, but they're not constraints on the player. You don't have to play to the whim of your traits. As another example, Civilization also has its share of great man theory in it. I mean, there are great people all over the place, and the leaders of nations are definitely emphasized. However, I would argue that the state is still able to function without at least great people. Great people are a strategy in some sense, but they aren't critical. They lack the same necessity and emphasis of EU4. Great man theory is possibly one of the best ways to explain history to other people in a way that they'll relate to. It emphasizes the potential for history to be a narrative. It turns history from a collection of facts to a collection of stories about heroes. On some level, we might even dream of being the hero of our age, just like the figures Thomas Carlyle championed when laying out his theory. We can aspire to be the next Napoleon. But the theory never gets around to questioning if that's a good idea. Put a pin in that. Simplicity is helpful for history, but also always a risk. Nuance is very important to how we understand events. Great man theory is, by design, always a simplification. It's a neat answer to complicated questions. The good of this is that it provides an easy-to-consume baseline narrative for students, with memorable events, putting names and sometimes even faces to history. In fact, this is more or less how I learned history for a majority of high school. My teacher didn't even really use dates. Everything was in reference to something else, and the linchpins were often significant individuals like Napoleon, Kant, Nietzsche, Joseph II sticks out for some reason. Any of the greats, of course. My teacher turned history into a narrative by sometimes, well, it wasn't personifications of nations, thankfully. It was attributing history to the actions of individuals. It can keep things from being wordy and tiring and stodgy. The issue is that sometimes the nuance is important, and on occasion, we would fall into basically using armchair psychoanalysis and truisms to explain historical events. Think Napoleon complex. The idea that his short stature led to his unfaltering ambition. That could be a reason for the Napoleonic Wars. Certainly Napoleon's existence was a large part of it, by definition. But it's reductive to pin the realities of an era, the events, the story, on the ego of one dead man who may not have even felt the way we ascribe to him. Great man theory falls apart the more one invites nuance, and also the more one steps away from perfect autocracy as a presumption of governance. Put another way, things don't always go as planned for leaders, and the bumps along the way are a part of history. Let's look at this from another perspective. Who made Civilization, the games, as a series? Who can you name? Is it really Sid Meier's game? He's what we would call an auteur. a man credited with the vision and talent of a collective project. They exist in all mediums that require entire teams to create their art. Think about how we refer to directors in relation to movies, a Ridley Scott film, a Tarantino movie, etc. In essence, great man is the auteur theory of history, but I don't think it's necessarily an intentional simplification so much as using what got recorded. We don't have a credits list, a recorded history of the names of all who actually labored to build the Great Wall, you know? Yes, of course, empowered individuals who get credit do disproportionately shape history, and the things they've made, their accomplishments, wouldn't be the same without them. But in a way, that's also true for the uncredited, lesser contributors, is it not? Great man theory hits an interesting double bind. It supposes that societies must be rigid and to some degree innately autocratic, but then that they must also give just enough latitude of mobility that truly remarkable people can seize the reins. In reality, monarchism doesn't allow for that, does it? I can't submit my application to become King of Norway on merit of my GPA, even if it were higher than a given prince. In this light, EU4's depiction is a simple and an accurate one. Your monarchy doesn't have a bunch of dynasty flips in order to keep S-tier rulers on the throne. You get a random lottery. Sometimes an heir comes out as a 0-1-0 and you're stuck with them unless you can disinherit. No great man proved himself to be a true ruler in that case. Upward mobility doesn't need to exist in a world of great men because those men are endowed from birth with the ability needed to rise. The game only really applies great man theory insofar as it emphasizes the sway of the few over the many. But the biggest issue with great man theory is yet to come. Hey, so detour time? Thomas Carlyle, the father of great man theory, is very, very much not a good person. To some extent, it doesn't appear on the surface to inform his work with respect to heroic people and all, but I do think it bears noting that he basically wrote a straw man devil's advocate argument in favor of the slave trade, partially to present these arguments through the conceit of an unreliable reporter recounting a speech he heard once somewhere. There's layers of abstraction, and in his fictitious story, the speech gets booed, but when people, including friends of his, called him out for writing a biased, racist tirade, he basically doubled down and removed the conceit but kept the content, in effect claiming his once fictional arguments as his own thoughts. Wow. Anyway, this gets him into a debate of sorts with John Stuart Mill, and I'll say this, on some level it ties back to the dark underbelly of great man theory. The debate centers on what Mill sees as Carlyle's focus on authority through strength and the law of force and cunning. Viewed in this lens, great man theory is essentially an alternate form of social Darwinism before the term social Darwinism. It advocates for rule by the fittest, and Mill, rightfully, discusses this inadvertently through Carlyle's work on race. Great man theory ultimately uses a recursive loop to prove itself. Look at these great people who accomplished great things. Surely only great people accomplish great things. The things these people did were great. The supposedly obvious conclusion of great man theory, of course certain individuals disproportionately impacted history, can be turned in on itself to say, of course history looks like the agency of a few individuals if we give them all that narrative power. And that power we grant them is in service of reaffirming that it works. It is its own false proof that society needs to be, as Mill derided, authority through strength for great men to triumph. It's a vicious cycle that spirals into some dark places. In the way the game displays the great men, EU4 does not end up parading them as amazing people, figures that only arrive once in a century. There will always be level 3 advisors available. Events only determine how cheap one might be, or they might bring a boost to stability, but so will letting a minstrel travel the country. The game itself doesn't really reinforce the darker parts of the theory, but it does demonstrate the general ideas behind it, and in its framing and limitations, shows some of the limitations of the theory itself. Speaking of, if there are such strong critiques, why do we keep using the theory? Well, on a base level, it's comfy. I don't want to psychoanalyze entire cultures because that's always a bad idea, but I can imagine that for cultures that prefer individual narratives over collective ones, great man theory just slots right in where mythology used to be. That's even what Carlyle's idea of hero worship suggests. There's a religious aspect to it all. Great men are divine in some way, destined at the least. It's a far less materialist perspective than those that arose around it. It certainly provides a different lens than Hegel and Marx, for example, though it certainly also derives from Hegel. Ultimately, it's not incredibly hard to see why it appeals, both for the ease of teaching in this lens and the ease of consumption of that narrative. And it's not that teaching through great men automatically slides into worse things. It's not instantaneous cult worship of Frederick the Great or something. But it is something to keep in mind, and it's something we'll be looking at on the opposite side in the next video, social history and humankind. If you're just coming into this series here, I have a previous video explaining historiography via the Civilization series, and I'll have more coming to this series soon, so maybe subscribe if you don't want to miss that. Yeah, bye.